Hi, everybody. So we're getting ready for, not getting ready, we're starting the National Story of Ukraine Part 3, although actually this is the fourth lecture, so I don't know if you should call it Part 3 or Point 4. Anyways, doesn't matter. So let's pick up where we left off. We were talking about the disappointment of the Cossacks that they were able to not ultimately maneuver successfully between these, and I was using the analogy, these whales, right, of the dolphin. And eventually they aligned themselves with Russia, but you guys know Mazeppa had seen maybe a window of opportunity at the Great Northern War with Sweden as battling Russia. Mazeppa, leading the Cossack Hetman, felt that maybe there's a chance for us to break free and be independent. And you guys know, sadly, that did not happen. Now, Russia had already been expanding by this time period, and so there's a reason why Sweden's come into contact with Russia, because Russia's growing increasingly strong and have been for quite a while. It's in the process of amassing what we see as a Russian empire. And Peter the Great, who you guys see there on the left, right here, is going to be a big part of that. Although it actually started before Peter the Great. Peter the Great is a big and important part of that. And that great battle of Poltava, which you see a depiction by a Russian artist right here in 1709, which is won by Peter the Great and his forces against the Swedes. But the focus of our story, the Ukrainians who joined them, Mazeppa and other Ukrainian Cossacks who joined them. But the defeat at the hands of the Russians means Ukrainian hopes to remain perhaps or maneuver for independence from Russian control are dashed. And that's only going to accelerate even more with the successor to Peter the Great, which is not immediately, but shortly, which is going to be Catherine the Great. I have a couple paintings of her there, which we'll get to in a minute, but we can go ahead and so let me highlight this for you guys. So for those of you guys taking notes, here we go. There we go. Okay. Now she's increasingly, and that had been happening under Peter already, but she furthers and solidifies Russia's annexation of what we know as a Cossack hetman. Again, something happened under Peter already, but she, in many ways, completes it. And so the Cossack Hetman ceases to exist and replaced by her vision of what's recurring to the lands of Ukraine as Little Russia, incorporating that into the Russian Empire. Of course, what that means, of course, is that independent Ukrainian national identity is swallowed up in this Russification, as Catherine the Great's policies, and of course succeeding czars after Catherine, ceased attempt to eradicate any leanings of the people of Ukraine for independent existence outside of the Russian sphere of influence and control. That painting on the left shows her in her regal robes, and I chose that because, again, she is one of Russia's great powerful leaders, and it shows the wealth and opulence of her court and her projection of power. The one on the right is also her. That's not a man. That's also Catherine. And even though she's not the general in command, but she is the power and command of her generals, and Russia expands quite dramatically during this time period as well. For example, they're going to seize the Crimean Peninsula from the Crimean Tartars or the Ottoman Empire during this time period. And so the entirety of today we see of Ukraine is largely seized during Catherine's reign, although there's a little bit exceptions to the west, but largely so. So what you guys want to know is, here we go. So let me hide this for you guys. There we go. Okay. So again, she's trying to transform the Cossack Hetman into Little Russia, and she's Russifying their culture. Now, here's where it gets a bit more complicated. As you guys know, the Cossack Hetman was always quite vulnerable because of its size, and so there are some Cossack elite and some Cossack citizens who feel like maybe there'll be greater stability under Russian control. You know, we're not able to maintain our independence the way we want it. And so worst comes to worst, if we have to be part of the empire, maybe the Russian Empire is to be okay. And some of the Cossack elite, the officers and the nobility, some of them are granted a similar status in the Russian Empire. So they transition into it and start serving the Russian army. Some had already been doing it, but they do that even more. And so Cossack units become formally parts of the Russian army. as they're trying to make the best, I suppose, of a tough situation. Like, what's the reality? Russia's too dominant. They've won. My life has to go on. Me pining for the Cossack hetman, which no longer exists, in the eyes of some of them, no longer makes sense, and they're adjusting themselves to the reality of Russian control and to try to maneuver as best they can in this new Russian-dominated future. This is important. I want to highlight this for you guys, and that is Catherine introduces serfdom into Ukraine. This is a retrograde movement, right? This is going kind of back in time, that serfdom, which was not practiced in the Cossack hetman, although there were certainly low classes and peasant classes, but outright serfdom did not exist in the Cossack hetman. But Catherine, which exists in Russia already, she introduces it forcibly into the Ukraine. Taras Shevchenko, who we talked about earlier, the great poet, writer, artist, this is one of the many things, of course, that could deeply bother him. Because as you guys remember, Taras was also born, Shevchenko was born as a serf, as you guys know, as a non-free person in the Russian Empire. So what Catherine does here, several generations later, is going to impact, well, of course, impact all Ukrainians who are serfs, but it's going to be a part of that narrative of Ukrainians wanting their freedoms and pining back to a better age or a future age no longer dominated by an exploitive, dominant Russia. The maps you see in front of you right here are showing, and this one's kind of hard to read, but you can see the Crimean Peninsula right there in green. All the areas you guys see here in blue, and that, I guess that's light tan and green, are seized by Catherine during her reign. So this, again, today would be the southern portion of Ukraine. For example, Odessa being right here on the coast of Ukraine. There's the Crimean Peninsula, of course. And she seizes it from the Khanate. It's been a long, busy day. All the way from the Ottoman Empire. But the Khanate, who had controlled that nominally, well, not nominally, maybe directly under a relationship with the Ottoman Empire, but she's able to break that off from the Ottoman Empire and seize that and directly place this region under Russian control, along with parts that which will be Western Ukraine as well. Now, this next part, I don't want to get bogged down. In fact, I'm going to do it quite briefly. And we're going to go through a lot of years. You see, we're going from 1764 to the 20th century. And we're going to do that briefly. Ukrainian history, again, it's a long history. It's complicated, but we're just trying to hit the highlights like a pebble skipping across the top of a lake. So, and some of this, by the way, I want to highlight this for you guys once you guys write this down. But below this, I'm not as concerned whether you take notes. I just want you to listen to and get a sense of what's taking place. So, Ukraine, or Little Russia, is under Russian control all the way from 1764 all the way till the 20th century, really until 1991, when Ukraine and the modern world fall in the fall of the Soviet Union. Ukraine gets independence. But even among the Ukrainians who lived in what you say is Ukraine, there's many different visions of like, what does it look like? So should we simply accept ourselves as some version of Russians because that is a reality, or should we struggle for some kind of independent national existence? And the Ukrainians themselves at times are split over that. To complicate that reality, during the 19th century and even a little bit into the 18th century, a series of revolutions breaks out in parts of Eastern Europe, or Europe in general, but Eastern Europe in the context of our class, that are going to resonate for many Ukrainians. In the case, this one will be Poland. Now, Ukraine has had a very long and not good history of Poland. We haven't gone into deep details in our class about this, but Poland and Lithuania controlled large portions of Ukraine. The Cossack hetman, at least a western portion, a northern portion, was oftentimes controlled by Poland. The Ukrainians felt exploited by the Polish nobles who ruled over them. They resented them. At times they fought against them. At times they allied with them. Well, I mentioned how Catherine and her power is expanding, and part of that is going to be Poland weakening, so much so that by the late 1700s, Poland as an independent nation has ceased to exist, which, of course, just like Ukraine, is a national calamity for Poland. There's still many Poles, of course, who desperately want a revival and a seizing back of independence and freedom from, in this case, Russia. because Russia is the one who effectively ends Poland. So what you see in front of you is the great Polish national hero, Kosciuszko, and I hope I pronounced him right correctly in the Polish, or at least close to that, the great national hero of Poland, who leads one of the first great uprisings of the Poles against Russian control. And that being 1794, and that's Kosciuszko right here, and that's also him there on the right. Now, by the way, here's a tie with U.S. history. Kosciuszko would actually come and fight in the American Revolution, and would be very helpful in the American Revolution, fighting for our freedom here. Inspired by that, and of course, he already had a desire for freedom in Poland. Following the American Revolution, where he fights bravely on the side of us, the Americans, he returns to Poland with these liberal ideas and the idea of the success of a revolution, and he'll take to Poland and fight against a Russian domination of Poland. Now, sadly for Poland, his efforts are going to fail, but he still this day remains a great hero in Poland for his attempt to break Poland free of Russian domination and control. But that continues. Not long after that, Napoleon, as you guys know, Napoleon is going to seize control of most of Europe. Now, Napoleon's also constructing a French empire, but here's what gets a bit more complicated. Even though Napoleon is constructing a French empire in many ways, but he is still a son of the French Revolution. So there's some nuance and complexity in there, and that, yes, France does want to be the top dog. By France, I mean Napoleon. And his armies are seizing control of most of Europe. But here's where it gets more complicated. But he's also a son of the revolution. So Napoleon's vision of the new reality is, yes, France is dominant, but we also are progressive, which sounds kind of odd, right? You're dominant, progressive. Although in some ways, I guess the U.S. at times has been that way too. So Napoleon is talking about breaking off the old traditional monarchies and feudalism and so forth that's held Europe in chains of class and nationality and so forth. And so in the context of Poland, Napoleon sees a potential ally in the Poles, and Russia he sees as an enemy. And so Napoleon suggests, not just suggests, signs into a resumption of an independent Polish state centered on Warsaw, the Polish capital. And that painting you see depicted on the right there is Napoleon signing up. And of course, for the Poles, there's tremendous excitement that maybe with French help and French military power and the genius of Napoleon, perhaps we in this window of French dominance can regain our nationhood from the domination of the Russians. Now, as you guys know, eventually Napoleon invades Russia, and eventually he's defeated at Waterloo, and eventually Napoleon is defeated. So the Poles' brief window of opportunity, we thought Napoleon will allow us and be assistance enough getting our freedom from Russia. That collapses, and Poland continues under Russian domination. In the 1830s, there's another critically important massive uprising in Poland against Russian control. Very hard fighting in Poland against the Russians, but the Russians will eventually crush this uprising, and Poland remained firmly under Russian control all the way up to really World War I. Now, why are we talking about this? Because this is going to be an inspiration for the Ukrainians. Again, the Ukrainian relationship with Russia is Ukrainian relationship with Poland is not good, but they now are in the similar boat. Both of them having been occupied and attempt to be Russified under Russian control, and so both Poland and Ukraine, again, bloody history between the two of them and a domination on the part of Poland toward Ukraine in many cases, but Ukrainians see these Polish aspirations for nationhood and statehood and freedom and independence, and that inspires some Ukrainians to ask and hope for the exact same thing. And that's where we get to growing nationalism in Europe and the impact on some Ukrainians. Let me highlight that for you guys. So, of course, Poland is the closest example to the Ukrainians, but other places too in Europe. Especially in 1848, there's revolutions throughout Europe, liberal revolutions trying to dramatically modernize and liberalize, in many cases, the governments of Europe. Now, most of those, for the most part, are going to fail under a conservative repression in Europe. But again, with that excitement of speaking our indigenous language and our own culture and our identity as a people, all that resonated with a certain set of Ukrainians who don't have those, of course, because they're part of the Russian Empire. That piece you see on the right actually comes from 1920, which is a bit in the future. We're not quite there yet, but that feeling is already emerging in the 1800s. And that shows Ukrainians right here, the good guys. That's the Ukrainian woman in the Ukrainian national dress. And it shows on the one side the Poles and the Russians assaulting this vision of Ukrainian national identity and statehood. So let me give you a specific example of that. You guys would know this gentleman. This professor of history, Mykola Kostomarov. There we go, Kostomarov. And what is his significance? He is the founder of modern Russian historiography, or history writing, may say in a simpler kind of way, and also an important source of early Ukrainian nationalism. And I'm going to give you a short version. You don't need to write all this down. But now, he is part Russian, part Ukrainian. His father is Russian, his mother is Ukrainian. Most of his work is actually in Russia, in St. Petersburg, with the Russian capital in that time period. So he's a Russian historian and a Ukrainian historian. But as you'll see, I think his heart is most strongly drawn, although he's a split identity, to his Ukrainian side and his Ukrainian ancestry. So much so that he's going to write seminal or these critical books that really talk about the nationhood of Ukraine. And that book is that one you see depicted right here, the Book of Genesis of the Ukrainian people. Now, he writes history of Russia as well. But that book is so important because if you are a Ukrainian, of course, in Russian-occupied Ukraine, but you want to know a narrative that does not focus just on a Russian version of Kievan Rus and then Peter the Great and Catherine and what a wonderful thing it is to be part of the Russian Empire now, but you want to see an independent history of Ukraine as a people. That book is one of the first modern examples, perhaps the first modern example you can read as a history book of the Ukrainian people as its own entity and nation and culture. That's why he's so critical, and that's what you guys want to know about him. Additionally, he and Taras Shevchenko, who we talked about earlier, the great poet and artist, are going to join this organization called the Brotherhoods of St. Cyril and Methodius. By the way, you guys know Cyril and Methodius, right? Great heroes of Eastern Europe in general, and Ukraine, of course, as well, too. They joined this brotherhood, and this brotherhood is an early kind of nationalist political organization. And I do want you guys to know what they're calling for because it's important. So, where are we going here? Here we go. Let me highlight this for you guys. Looks like I have a typo in there too. Give me a second here. Let me fix that. Thank you, Word. Okay. So this Brotherhood of St. Cyril Methodius that Kostomarov joins along with Taras Shevchenko and some other intellectuals too, and writers and thinkers. This Brotherhood of St. Cyril Methodius, they're attempting to revive Ukrainian culture. That means written Ukrainian language, Ukrainian literature. They're hoping to somehow have some liberal, more free version of Ukraine. They weren't directly in that time period calling for a complete independent break, although I'm sure they would have loved that. I think perhaps they're thinking more realistically, we can have just a much greater view of autonomy. That's why I call them proto-nationalists, because they're early nationalists. Maybe realistically, they're not sure necessarily they can be independent, although they love that vision. So probably long-term, the logical consequence of their thought, emphasis on Ukrainian language, identity, history, culture, outlook, is, of course, ultimately would be nationhood. By the way, it's part of his participation in that in poetry, right? About that Taras Shevchenko, we talked about a few lectures back. That's why he's arrested by the Tsar and sent into exile, because this organization is seen, obviously, as a political and cultural threat to Russification of what is Ukraine. That's a stamp of him, by the way, in modern Ukraine is after independence. And again, they're saying he's one of our godfathers of our independent Ukrainian nationhood in the modern era. All right, and that takes us to a complicated, big topic, but we're not going to make it complicated and big. We're not going to do that. We're going to try to make this, even though, again, we could spend maybe 3 or 4 lectures on this next topic because it's complicated, it's dense, it involves a lot of moving parts, different individuals, and things are fluctuating within just months of each other. But we're not going to go in that level of detail. It's too much for the context of our class. But Water One is to provide Ukraine with a brief window of opportunity for freedom and nationhood. And I want you guys to know that. A typo I did fix there. Okay, so let me highlight this for you guys. There's so much going on during the World War I years and the years immediately after that, that again, it's fascinating. It's also inspiring and terrible all simultaneously. So World War I, of course, in our American context, we tend to focus on the Western Front, the German invasion of Belgium and France and the English, the British getting involved and all the terrible fighting there in the Somme and Verdun and Passchendaele and all these epic and terrible places of combat on the Western Front. But as you guys are probably well aware, there's a terrible war going on the Eastern Front too between Germany and Russia, although it's not just Germany and Russia. You have Bulgaria, other countries involved too. But for the sake of this class, I'm going to keep it quite simple. The two biggest players by far, though, are Germany and Russia. So in that terrible fighting, and by the way, this is important I'm going to mention right now, Germany honestly is going to win that fight. Now, they don't win World War I overall, as you guys know. Germany's going to lose World War I. But in reality, they win the fight on the Eastern Front against Russia. Russia's going to lose that fight. Part of the Russian loss and the catastrophe of that loss and the terrible bloodletting the Russians experience, as you guys know, is going to be the Bolshevik or Russian Revolution. And that's why I have these two images here showing the fighting between Russian soldiers and German soldiers on the Eastern Front. And then you see a picture of Vladimir Lenin leading the revolt of the workers. And both these events, the terrible fighting in the war, the changing of boundaries, the weakening of Russia, and the Bolshevik or Russian Revolution is going to really impact Ukraine dramatically. There's a picture in this case, used to be a Russian army unit. By the way, this gentleman right here likely is a Cossack soldier, a la from Ukraine, fighting in the Russian army against the Germans. And of course, there is Lenin. Now, the context of Lenin is going to appeal to obviously many of the workers of parts of the world, not just in Russia, as you guys know, but importantly in the context of our class, to many Ukrainian peasants as well, too. Remember, they've been part of the Russian Empire now for, gotta do the math here, 130, 40, 50 years. That's generations. To some degree, many of them are Russified, although not all of them. As you know, there's still people who are hoping for a different independent Ukrainian identity. But the Bolshevik appeal, which is if you're a poor person, if you're a peasant, we'll give you food, we'll give you land. This sounds awful good to many Ukrainian peasants as well. And that'd be very important what comes up here in a minute. Now, I mentioned Germany is winning the war on the Eastern Front against the Russians. Let me show you a map right here what we're talking about. If you look carefully, you guys see this green line right here? This is at the end of World War I. Germany has entirely kicked the Russians out of what is today Crimea. Because that's taken place, because Crimea is a breadbasket, as you guys know, industry there plus its fantastic farmland, the Ukrainian nationalists are wondering, because the Germans probably don't really care, frankly, because the Germans are now in charge, would the Germans allow us to declare an independent nation? In exchange, by the way, what do the Germans get out of it? In exchange is we'll ship a lot of food to a very hungry Germany this late in the war. So the Germans kick out the Russians, provide this window of time. We'll declare an independent nation outside of Russian control. And what do we get back to Germans? Food, grain, wheat, corn, all this cornucopia, agricultural products that comes out of Ukraine. That happens. So the Ukrainians declare independence. There's tremendous excitement, but it's complicated from the start because, of course, it's dependent on the German protection, of course. And here's where it gets even more complicated. The leaders of the independence movement don't have all Ukrainians back for this. There's a mixture. For example, there are some Russians actually live in Ukraine. They're not so excited about this. Then also Ukrainian peasants feel, well, this independent Ukrainian nation, I'm not against that, but the Bolshevik Revolution we hear about in Russia sounds fantastic. It sounds like a better deal because it's Ukrainian independent state. They're not promising us land and agricultural business reform. They're promising a Ukrainian future. That's fine. But in Russia, which we've been part of, as you guys know, we're used to that, we're seeing this earthquake in human society, this wonderful utopia dawning, which is the Bolshevik Revolution, bringing a class of society, economic equality, social equality. That sounds awful good to us too. Maybe we should do that. Maybe we should do the Bolshevik Revolution instead of this, we don't know what's going to happen, Ukrainian state. So Ukrainians are split. And again, the only reason it's possible is because of German victories there. So what it means is you have different versions, and I'm going to show you this visually too, and I'm going to highlight this for you guys. So you have a whole series of different versions of what's going to happen in Ukraine. Of course, somewhat an independent, will be more Western aligned Ukrainian nation. Ukrainians want an independent nation, but perhaps more of a conservative version of that, a traditional version of that. Then, of course, you have some who want a Marxist revolutionary state. Remember the Bolshevik Revolution, Marxism and communism, it sounds awful good. And some of them want a Marxist state directly under the control of the Soviet Union. That's why I put all these flags right here, different versions among Ukrainians themselves of what they want for their future. I mentioned it being complicated. I'm giving you guys a simplified view. There's even more to the story. I'm trying to keep it short. So Ukraine briefly is independent. Let me highlight this for you guys. But briefly is the right word. From 1917 to 1918, they're briefly independent because of German assistance. And then from 1918 to 1921, parts of Ukraine are independent, but they're immediately besieged by a variety of problems. Internal fighting within Ukrainians themselves. The Bolsheviks, of course, don't want to lose the breadbasket and agricultural, and also just the people, the tax base, the industrial capacity of Ukraine. So they also want to re-seize control of Ukraine. Poland is disputing Ukraine for parts of what would be today northern Ukraine, which are dispute between northern Ukraine and Poland. Both Poland, which is trying to get its independence too, and Ukraine are eyeing each other's territory, and so there's very intense fighting between those two. So what that means is you have what's called the Soviet-Ukrainian War, which takes place from November 1917 to November 1921, and Russia and ultimately the Bolsheviks under Lenin and Trotsky are going to eventually win that war. But before that, you had the Polish-Ukrainian War. Again, today we see kind of northern Ukraine into southern Poland. Now it's intense fighting as Poland and Ukraine are both fighting, as they see, for survival against each other. And there's already bad blood between the two of them. And both of them also hoping to get territory from the other one. That ended in 1919. But the end of all this, tragically for Ukraine, these wars are not only very bloody, many Ukrainians die in the process of these wars, but ultimately they're not going to be able to maintain their independence as an independent nation because the Bolsheviks and the Red Army will eventually, took a while, but eventually crush the Ukrainian independent state, and they'll be returned into the Russian imperial system. Just some artwork showing you at its heyday, the Ukrainian Republic controlled this region right here. But again, there's relatively brief window of time when they control that. But in the eyes of contemporary Ukrainians, though, this was like an early birth to the modern Ukrainian nation, even though, sadly, in the eyes of Ukrainians, it didn't last very long. That's one of the important Ukrainian generals. This would be in eastern Ukraine. There's a Ukrainian fighter plane, which contemporary Ukrainians are asking for right now. They're wanting Western fighter planes battling Russia currently. This is the Red Army under Trotsky. That's Trotsky right here. Eventually, that Bolshevik Red Army under Trotsky would successfully be able to invade into Ukraine and crush the Ukrainian attempt at nationhood and return Ukraine to the Soviet Empire or the Russian Empire. I have a recommendation for you guys. I know you guys are busy. You probably don't have time for this right now, but keep this in mind for the future. If you're really curious about this chaotic time period of warfare and complexity, and I didn't even go to a quarter of that or less of the complexity of that story. I kept it kind of simple so you guys don't get lost what's taking place here. But there's a brilliant Russian writer named Isaac Babel. So Babel is actually Jewish. He has a lot of sympathy. By the way, he was born in Ukraine. Again, this work gets kind of complicated. We call him a Russian writer. I suppose he considers him Russian, but he's actually born in Ukraine, grows up in Ukraine, and writes extensively about his service in the Russian army and the terrible fight between the Russians and the Poles, because the Russians and Poles were also fighting this time period, the massacres he sees, the attacks on the Jewish community he sees, Russia was going through a terrible civil war, which I didn't go into in this time period. You have what's called the White Russians, the Red Russian Army. He sees a lot of this terrible fight and writes about it in that classic book, Red Cavalry. Another book, Odessa Stories. And Odessa, of course, is a southern Ukrainian city. And of course, because he spent time in Odessa. And so if you want a window from a brilliant writer, because he was a great Russian writer / Ukrainian author, a brilliant writer, and you want to get a window in this chaotic time period, what it would be like to be in a Russian military unit in this time period, there's no better choice than Isaac Babel. Tragically, and not surprisingly, based on what Russia does, Isaac Babel will be executed by the NKVD, which is a predecessor of the Russian, well, I suppose a predecessor of the KGB or similar organizations later on. But the NKVD arrest him, fabricated terrorism, espionage charges, and executed in 1940 under Stalin's orders. He wasn't a terrorist or involved in espionage. He simply was a free thinker. There it is, free thinker. An honest observer of the reality around him and wrote about what he saw. And of course, in Stalin's Russia, that's a death sentence. You can't be honest. You can't be an independent free thinker. You can only keep your head down and hope to survive by closely following Stalin. You can't report honestly what you see, the violence and the massacres and things that took place in an earlier time period. It's not acceptable. And Isaac Babel will be killed by the NKVD during the Great Purges in Russia. By the way, many Ukrainians would die in that situation too. Great Purges, which we'll talk about that in a later lecture, will kill many Ukrainians as well too. And that takes us to a terrible, sad topic, which is the Holodomor. And again, this is a deep topic, and you guys are actually reading the piece on this. That piece you guys read by Lev Kopelev, Terror in the Countryside, which is an awful piece to read, but incredibly powerful. And also Myron Dolett's Famine in the Ukraine, both of these terrible pieces, which you guys read for class this week, are, I say wonderful in the worst kind of way, but a very personalized introduction of what it's like, this mass genocide by Stalin targeting Ukrainian opponents. And that's what I want you guys to know. So in your notes, the Holodomor, which we call the Ukrainian famine, is an imposed famine by Joseph Stalin on people in Ukraine who he sees an opponent, in fact or potential. That famine takes place from 1932 to 33. It wasn't that Ukraine didn't have food. There is food. So that's why I say it's an artificial famine. Now, it is true in Russia there are food shortages, so a lot of grain is being sent to Russia and other places because of the insanity of Stalin's collectivization, taking all the peasants from the land and forcing them onto these collective farms. And of course, not surprisingly, these collective farms and the output and the top-down structure, the rigid state control is not good for agriculture, does not work well for agriculture. So you do have poor harvest of parts of Russia because of the idiotic short-sighted policies of collectivization, which does very poorly when it comes to grain production, farm production. So Russia is struggling for food. Ukraine, no. But Stalin almost sees like a win-win. A, I can get food for parts of Russia that need it, that are not doing well under my plan, although he would not admit that, of course. But he's also deeply suspicious of Ukrainians, feeling that there's a budding Ukrainian nationalism. By the way, he's not wrong about that, right? Remember, Ukraine had attempted to be free, and only the Bolsheviks under Lenin and Trotsky had crushed them. And Stalin, of course, is living through all this. That's not deep history. That's just a decade earlier than this, really. So time-wise, it's really a decade earlier, slightly more than a decade. But Stalin sensing that, and sensing that many Ukrainians are not fully assimilated into Russia, and even more specifically, not assimilated into the Bolshevik communist vision, and are skeptical of it. For example, Ukrainian peasants that have their own farmland want to keep their own farmland. They do not want to join a collective farm. They're quite successful, and you guys know Ukraine has fantastic farming. They want to stay on their farm and farm their farm, and it's their farm, it's their land. Stalin, of course, sees that as a threat to the communist world that he's created, this scientific revolution as he saw he's creating, and he sees these Ukrainian farmers and so forth as opponents, both an immediate threat to his collectivization plans, but additionally maybe a potential cultural and political threat as well too. And so he's going to take care of two problems simultaneously. deal with the shortfall in food in Russia, simultaneously deal with what's taking place in the Ukraine. And that is to eliminate these people through seasonal food from them. And that's what they do. That piece of artwork on the left is showing a family grieving the loss of a loved one who has starved to death, and you see the whole family is deeply emaciated. They might not survive too. On the right there, you can see why that is. Again, it's not because Ukraine didn't produce food in this time period, but it's all seized, or nearly all seized. This was called a red train. These would be communist officials in Ukraine. By the way, some of you are Ukraine themselves, because there's a Ukrainian Communist Party. So I don't want to give the depiction that this is entirely done by Russians from traditional Russia. Now, of course, there are Russians there too, but there's also Ukrainian communists who are also participating under orders from Stalin. And they are seizing control. You can see these carts heavily laden. You can see these bulging bags right here of grain being taken from the Ukrainian countryside to distribution and removal to Russia or places where Stalin wants this grain taken to. And what does this mean? Of course, there's just nightmare of starvation. And what an irony, a productive agricultural breadbasket, but experiencing profound starvation for many of the citizens. Now, not all of them, by the way. If you were part of the Communist Party in Ukraine, you're going to be safe. Well, at least for the moment. I should stress for the moment, because the purge is coming in the late 30s. But for the moment, you're safe. You're going to have access to food. So it depends who you are in Ukraine. This is not all Ukrainians, right? It's the politically suspect, independent Ukrainian farmers or anyone who is seen as being potentially a political threat. They're the ones who are being starved to death in this case. Now, estimates vary very widely how many Ukrainians die in this. And the numbers, again, I said widely, anywhere from 2 to 10 million, which is a huge range. Likely 10 million is perhaps way too high. One of the early historians really dug into this, historian Robert Spence, argued about 4.5 million died. More recently, Anne Applebaum, and her work is excellent. In fact, let me highlight that for you guys. Her very well received book, The Red Famine, Stalin's War in Ukraine, which came out in 2018, she argues around 3 million Ukrainians died. I recommend if you guys want to know more about the Ukrainian famine, just go into YouTube and you can type in Anne Applebaum Red Famine. There's some excellent talks which will go into much greater detail what we're talking about. And then the author of the textbook I'm relying heavily, which just came out even recently, by Serhiy Polacky, he's arguing that probably 4 million Ukrainians died in this terrible famine. We don't have a lot of photographic evidence of the famine for obvious reasons. It's under Russian control. For obvious reasons, they're hiding the reality. So we have very few photographic examples of this terrible human catastrophe, but we have a few. There's a young Ukrainian boy. You can see how sunken his eyes are, but his head is swollen. That's a sign of starvation. And again, there's one of very few photographs you have on the right, probably secretly taken, not probably, undoubtedly secretly taken there on the streets of Kharkiv in Ukraine, and shows peasants who have staggered in from the countryside because there's no food there, come to the city hoping to get into some of the soup kitchens, other things run by Ukrainians that have special permits and passes to go into those. But obviously, they tragically never got it, and they simply have crumpled and died there on the street. And you see Ukrainians walking past them. This map shows you the parts of Ukraine where the worst parts of the famine were. If you guys want to go a little bit deeper into this, and I recommend to you sources on the Holodomor. The movie Bitter Harvest came out in 2016. I'd recommend it to you guys. Maybe some of you have seen it. I imagine my Netflix or Amazon will have that movie. Bitter Harvest would be a good introduction to what we're talking about. There's Anne Applebaum's classic Red Famine. She came out just a few years back. Timothy Snyder will give you kind of the larger context of what's taking place here. And even more recently, there on the right, I think within the last year, a movie came out called Mr. Jones. And I'll explain that movie here in a minute, but also a window into the Ukrainian famine. Now, since this famine, of course, is under Russian control, the Russian authorities maintain very tight control, as you guys know, and have been doing that since the Bolshevik Revolution. Reporters and any independent observers cannot independently freely report what's taking place there, clearly. That movie, Mr. Jones, which I highly recommend to you guys, is depicting one very brave reporter. His name is Gareth Jones, and there he is. That's Gareth Jones right here. Gareth Jones, a Welsh reporter, travels into Russia, Soviet Union, and hears rumors that something dark is taking place in Ukraine and goes to investigate. and is able to get off a train and travel to the countryside, and it sees firsthand the nightmarish reality which you guys read about here in your textbook by Lev Kopolev and Milo Dolet, talking about just this crime against humanity, people in large numbers starving to death, and he witnesses it personally. Now, since he's Welsh, eventually he's arrested, not surprisingly, but the Soviet authorities, perhaps afraid to kill him and the sour relationship with the Western world, expel him from Russia. But once he's expelled, he gives a press conference, and he, being a reporter, describes in detail what he has witnessed, this nightmare of the Holodomor in Ukraine. Now, I mentioned the battle for truth. By the way, this resonates in 2023, even talking about the war in Ukraine currently. But the battle for truth, and this is a sad quote on this, Walter Duranty was probably the most famous American journalist of this time period. He's an American journalist from the New York Times to Moscow. Walter Duranty, for his own reasons, probably because of access to what the Russians are doing, he likes his position there being an icon of reporters. Perhaps he also had some sympathy for the Russian Bolshevik Revolution. Whatever the case may be, Walter Duranty denies Garrett Jones and others' accounts of what's taking place in Ukraine. Now, he did mention they're going through some hard times, they're hungry down there, but the idea of a mass nightmarish famine, Walter Duranty completely dismisses that. And since he's one of the most prominent American journalists of that era, when he dismisses that, in many ways, the world turns its eyes on what was really taking place there, because they don't have a lot of independent voices. And it's very highly respected, and I'd say very talented journalist, Walter Duranty, when he dismisses that, the Western press largely dismisses it as well. Now, in more recent times, it's not surprising that Walter Duranty, who won the Pulitzer Prize for his reporting from Russia, has come under severe criticism. So much so that there's been calls for the Pulitzer Prize committee to retroactively go back and strip him of his Pulitzer Prize, even though he died in 1957, because of his role in suppressing the truth, what was really going on in Ukraine. You can see that book on the right, by S.J. Tyler, called Stalin's Apologist, Walter Duranty, and New York Times Man in Moscow. Again, talking about his protection of the reality of the nightmare taking place in Ukraine with the Holodomor, but other things as well, too. But I mentioned this guy, and I want you to know him. Let me highlight it for you guys. And actually, Walter Duranty, too. That sad struggle over truth. I mentioned this guy, Reverend Gareth Jones. Now, he's not well known as a reporter. He's a Welsh journalist who travels into the darkness of the Holodomor in Ukraine, witnesses it firsthand, is able to get out, although he's arrested, but he's kicked out, and once out, tries to let the world know the reality of what's taking place. He's one of the very few. There's a couple other reporters, too, but he's probably the most prominent, one of the very few contemporary reporters at the time period who spoke out to the larger world and said, there's a terrible nightmare taking place right under our noses in Ukraine, in Ukraine occupied by the Soviet Union or Russia. But there were others, but these actually come much later. Lev Kopolev, who you guys read here in your textbook, Lev Kopolev not only witnessed the outside observer, he was a participant in it, as you guys know. So that piece you guys read for our class, he's witnessing because he's involved in it. He's out on these red trains collecting grain. Now, eventually, Lev Kopolev will become profoundly disillusioned what he witnessed. But not when he participates. When he participates, even though it bothers him, but he's like, look, this is very hard, but we have to do this for the success of the Bolshevik Revolution. So these people who are starving to death, and it's sad, but we're leading to the greater good of humanity with the communist revolution. And so these Ukrainians who probably are disloyal and resistant, it's tragic they have to die, but the cause is a good one. So this pain and this loss and these tears are worth it for the greater scientific good, which is a revolution. If you're curious about him, his most classic book is called The Education of a True Believer. By the way, that book is hard to get your hands on. I just checked that book a few minutes ago, and I think the purchase of this hard copy is $250 through Amazon or some. So, but his voice on that is profound, as you guys read that excerpt there in class, and also just psychologically what it's like to be part of that grand machine, that very dark machine, which is the communist Bolshevik system under Lenin and Trotsky, and ultimately under Stalin, and to be completely a part of it and to witness this grinding of humanity in the gears of this revolution for utopia. And of course, that utopia never taken place, but the blood and the bones being crushed sure is real, and his eventual awakening to that reality. And we're nearly done. So, St. Michael's domed monastery is part of this story too. The Winter on Fire, you guys, a documentary I'm having you guys watch, which is due a bit later, but you guys are in the process of watching that. You'll see this St. Michael's Dome Monastery frequently in these very climactic moments in the Maidan protest and an attempt to have freedom and enjoy in Europe. And you'll see over and over St. Michael's in the background. That is St. Michael's today. That's the bell tower, which you'll also see in that documentary that you guys are watching shortly, or maybe you've started already. And that's St. Michael's church there in the background. This is an example of a Ukrainian national treasure. It dates all the way back to ancient Rus, although this contemporary version, as you'll see here in a minute, has been recently constructed. But the original cathedral and church goes all the way back to ancient Rus. Be badly damaged in the Mongol sack and occupation of Kiev in 1240, but eventually be rebuilt. So you can see the beauty of it too, and its symbolic nature to the Ukrainian people as a part of their Christian heritage, their national heritage, their survival from ancient Rus to the modern world. And maybe I'll highlight this for you guys. Here we go. Give you guys a minute to write some of that down. Although I want to wrap this up. Now, there's a mosaic from St. Michael's. That is St. Michael's interior today. And you're like, what's going on right here? Well, in the mid-30s, Stalin, not surprising because communism is atheistic. Following through on that and wanting to clear space for more modern buildings, communist officials decide, let's destroy St. Michael's. And they do. So they demolish St. Michael's, and you can see rubble of it here in the process of being demolished. They demolish it. Now, they did take out, fortunately, some of the artwork before they demolished it. He had some very talented artists when they removed a lot of the mosaics ahead of time, thank God. And the Russian authorities allowed them to do that, and so quite a few mosaics were saved. For example, this is a mosaic that was saved. Although it's exactly the same condition as it was before, we'll put that in the maybe. But it's demolished and made way for Soviet-era buildings to be put in its place. Now, that's not by accident, right? Not only is it showing indicative of Russian communism and Stalin's policies to destroy a religious center, a faith system, which is not aligned with communism, but additionally a Ukrainian national symbol as well, and to simply demolish it. It would be demolished all the way until 1991, following independence from Russia. Ukrainians, with memories of this piece of their national heritage, rebuilt St. Michael's. So this is St. Michael's today, and then that piece I showed you earlier at St. Michael's today. But that was rebuilt following Ukrainian independence after 1991, and around 2000 when they completed its reconstruction. But the fact that they had to do that is because in the Russian period, under Stalin's reign specifically, it had been leveled by Stalin's ideology and policies. And again, that helps you understand the Ukrainian national fight for independence from Russia. If one of your great icons of your religious faith and your architectural beauty and artistic beauty has been leveled under the Stalin period, not to mention the Holodomor and the factors, you can see why many Ukrainians will die rather than submit once again to the Russian yoke and Russian imperialism. And with that, we'll leave you with that iconic photograph there of St. Michael's, because it's time to wrap up this lecture. So wish you guys all the best. We just have one more lecture to get to, and that'll come soon. So until next one, take care, everybody.